Video game criticism is exorbitantly capable of making or breaking the successes of any of their subjects. The typical Middle Ages fantasy setting is by far the most popular world to set a role-playing game within. Best game and best boss have become rather synonymous. These mythologies were the primary inspiration for Kori-Odan games. Castlevania released on the NES in 1986. There has been a constant supply of video games throughout the past 40 years, across a massive range of platforms, hoping to capture the attention of billions of people. In that time, a tiny portion of games would enter the zeitgeist and occupy their audience's memories for the rest of their lives. Generations of video game players have their own collections of classics, and every individual has their own list of games they hold above all others. For my generation, games like Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid are held aloft as some of the greatest pieces of media ever produced. Others might feel this way about Chrono Trigger or The Last of Us, and there are hundreds of games that could appear among these as some of the best games ever made. Video game greatness has been hovering just out of my reach for most of my life. I have never played Final Fantasy VII. I have never played Chrono Trigger. I have never played Super Mario Bros. 3. In fact, my experience with video games was very sheltered, despite my fascination for the medium. So, at the end of 2020, I decided to play those games. Now, if you've seen my videos, you'll notice that I haven't kept to this theme very well. I couldn't help but indulge in some of the more obscure games, or the ones that are known to be mediocre, because I wanted to see them for myself. I created a list of every game I owned, and every game that I wanted to play, and randomly selected games from it. That's why there's a little bit of all over the placeness about the games in this video. Throughout my first 50 proper review videos, I played games on 14 different platforms. Games from before I was born, brand new games too. And as my original interest was to experience greatness, I have decided to rank all of the games I've played, in order of quality. Definitively. So naturally, this video will be entirely subjective, and ranked based on feel and my personal judgment. If you don't agree with me about one game or another, then you are absolutely correct, and I'm curious to learn why you disagree with me in the comments. Each section will feature a short explanation of the game, as well as my reasoning for placing it where I have. If you want to see where I've ranked a particular game, check the chapters. And for more details about each game, I'll have a card for the videos at the end of the segment. As for the order, I have chosen to hold the top 10 and bottom 5 for the very end of the video. If you're only interested in the extremes of the list, go to here. So, without any further ado, let's get going. Starting out at 45th Just Escaping the 5 Worst Games is the only From Software game I've reviewed so far. Otogi, Myth of Demons is a third-person hack-and-slash in the vein of Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, although it lacks much of the depth and charm those games possess. Players take on the role of Raiko, a goddess's puppet warrior who has been sent to the remains of a world torn apart by demonic power. Raiko must travel throughout the world and try to reclaim some semblance of peace from the invaders. This amounts to entering a series of levels to battle the enemies and collect powerful objects to hopefully drive the demons back. The premise and the developer alone make Otogi seem like a really interesting prospect, but the game fails to ever be worthwhile engaging with, both through mechanical complexity and spectacle. Raiko's attacks don't combo into each other particularly well, and almost all of the enemies in the game cannot be juggled, so interactions with the enemies are short and oftentimes don't result in progress through the level. It was generally better to spam heavy attacks throughout most encounters than it was to try and battle enemies with the rest of Raiko's abilities. The second half of the game is composed entirely of reused content, and the narrative's lack of presence completely removes any sense of stake and consequence to the player's success. You manage to kill the big slime on the boat, or you don't. The music's great though, and I'd be open for another playthrough if I ever get a hold of the second game. Next up, at 44th, is a game that appears to be far more fascinating than what it actually delivers. Mohawk and Headphone Jack is a technical marvel, a genuine achievement. Solid Software took the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 function to its extreme, and created a game that revolves around using the hardware function to simulate hundreds of different gravity vectors for the player to platform through. Kind of like a 2D Super Mario Galaxy, except a full decade earlier and running on comparatively archaic hardware. The game follows the story of the titular Mohawk as he journeys through his home planet to recover his people's CD collection from the evil General Headslot. The game is filled with fast-paced platforming, thousands of objects to collect, and even a few boss battles to overcome. While the gravity mechanic is undeniably a triumph, it is very difficult to look at. Every level is a nauseating combination of continuous spinning and uncontrollable speed. Mohawk is ridiculously fast when he gets going, which results in a lot of charging face first into enemies or causes the world to lose any semblance of place. Party Planet is remarkably grey or brown, and the enemies are similarly uninspired and uninteresting to look at. And they are everywhere, so it is rare that the player will ever be able to use Mohawk's high speed for anything. Solid Software were also heavily involved in the development of the 2D Bubsy games, which really says it all. At 43rd is Beholder, the debut release from Warm Lamp Games, in which the player has been assigned to act as the landlord of a residential building by the country's totalitarian regime. Carl's job is to ensure the building's amenities are in good working order, take calls from the government whenever they inquire, and rifle through the tenants' belongings to make sure they're not holding onto any forms of contraband or engaging in illegal activities. The residents of the buildings are active people, and Carl will often need to make choices in regards to acting in the interest of the state, his own personal gain, or attempting to hide the indiscretions of his tenants. Sometimes, Carl will be forced into action despite all of his efforts to avoid such a scenario, and the player must navigate the uncertainty that results from that choice. Beholder is unfortunately very bland. As nightmarish as this scenario is, the game offers very little reward for ever sticking Carl's neck out for anyone other than himself. Trying to play the game as though the residents are real people will result in Carl's entire family dying and then failing to meet the final objective's requirements. Blackmailing and backstabbing all of the tenants makes the game a breeze, and the game's simplistic presentation doesn't make this feel like an evil act. You just look at nodes for some red text and click on it, because the game actually encourages removing all humanity from its characters, keeping your head down. And maybe someday the totalitarian regime will be overthrown by an organization that you've refused to ever offer assistance to. Good moral, huh? In 42nd is a game with a title that really says everything you need to know. Submarine Attack was released in 1990, exclusively in PAL regions for Sega's first internationally available home console, the Master System. Submarine Attack is a simplistic shoot-'em-up that tasks the player to enter the subaquatic military facility of an enemy known as the Meta Creature and defeat the beast once and for all. Despite featuring a mere 6 levels and a front-to-back playthrough taking a total of 25 minutes, Submarine Attack took me 8 hours to finish. I said it was simplistic, I didn't say it was easy. I did quite enjoy my time with Submarine Attack. I found learning the mechanics and levels to be a lot of fun. I was engaging in a skill, learning something and getting better at it, and that's always satisfying. But where Submarine Attack fails is its extreme simplicity. Once you've gotten a grip on the controls and the ways in which enemies are spawned on the screen, there's nothing left. There are no challenges after that, so the game is over. It's a shame that I liked so many of the other games I played more than this one. The game in 41st place I also found to be very shallow, although it does a lot more to try and offer the player more to do. Shantae and the Pirate's Curse is the third game in the Shantae series, and the second after the series reboot on the DS. This time, Scuttletown is attacked by Risky Boots' forces as per usual, but something is amiss. A foreign dark magic spreads throughout Risky's troops. The power of the evil pirate master has seeped out from his grave and made its way onto Risky's fleet. Shantae and Risky team up to defeat the pirate master and send him back to his grave. The Pirate's Curse is a pseudo-Metroidvania style game. The world is not interconnected, but some of the levels are. Shantae's moveset becomes more advanced as the game goes on, as she unlocks different equipment to use to enter into hidden areas of previous levels. There are some neat bosses, and the soundtrack is ridiculously fun. It was the game's shallowness that landed it in this spot, though. And while the game does do some things very well, it just isn't a quality experience. The Pirate's Curse's level design is downright boring, and the combat is on par with the likes of Super Mario Bros. 3, an NES platformer from 25 years earlier. Shantae's platforming moveset ends up including a high-speed dash, a parachute, and 4 extra jumps while already being airborne. But the game never utilizes these abilities in inspired ways, and the final platforming gauntlet at the end of the game isn't much of a challenge at all. The majority of the bosses are tedious and uninspired. Dargon's mediocrity is the strongest memory I have of this game, which is a huge shame because the presentation is excellent. I'm holding out hope for Half Genie Hero and Seven Sirens, but so far my Shantae experience hasn't been so great. MorphX occupies the 40th place in the rankings, a Russian Xbox 360 exclusive third-person shooter in which the nameless player character attempts to resist the invasion of Moscow by a militaristic alien force. This character awakens in an alien nest with no memory and only the drive to get himself to the nearest hospital as soon as he can. The human resistance conclude that this means he is an alien operative, sent to flush the humans out from their safe spaces. So the character's journey is met with human and alien opposition. But something about the Resistance's idea seems to be true. Alien mutations gradually grow on the character's body, causing him to eventually become more alien as the game goes on. In the end, the character fulfills his alien purpose, despite all of his efforts not to. Mechanically, MorphX is a solid video game. The shooting controls well, exploration is incentivized by the unique upgrade system, there are a good variety of enemies to battle, even the visuals are decent. But MorphX's ideas aren't executed well at all. There aren't too many bugs, but the game performs like crap sometimes. The narrative is conceptually very cool, but it's stretched horrifically thin. The bosses are great spectacles, but they're so unbelievably shallow. It was never going to be a tremendously popular game, and releasing it in this unpolished state seems to have guaranteed that MorphX would be forgotten. Theme Park World lands at 39th, which is somewhat upsetting to me. but I wouldn't allow nostalgia to carry this game to a higher place in the rankings. While on their deathbed, Bullfrog managed to push out a couple of sequels to games that were well received at their height. One of which was Theme Park World, a sequel to Theme Park, which was released on a multitude of platforms during 2000. Theme Park World is a theme park management game with a wide variety of fantastical settings for the parks the player must manage. I played the PlayStation 2 version, which was not the version I played as a child, but the whimsical charm is still present in this version. It was great to see the horror and alien planet themes for the first time, but Theme Park World wasn't everything I remembered. 39th may actually be a little high, as this game is nowhere near the quality of titles like Theme Hospital and Dungeon Keeper, but it isn't totally devoid of positives. The issues are overwhelming though. The management tools are hard to even find, let alone understand. There is next to no statistical information to examine, and the method by which the game tells the player about guest and staff issues lacks any helpful detail at all. The ride selection is an impressive list of the same ride over and over. And despite the large number of ride models, they're generally not good looking. They don't look like fun rides, so it isn't ever exciting to research new ones. The PC version might be better. I hope so. Ranked 38th is another PlayStation 2 game. Kaya Dark Lineage is a 2003 3D platformer developed by French racing game developer Eden Games. Players follow Kaya's adventure through a mystical world that she was drawn into when her brother uncovers a hidden room in their home. The evil wizard Brazul has captured Kaya's brother, so Kaya must enlist the aid of the native people to rescue him. There are lots of colourful environments to platform through, a surprisingly in-depth combat system, and a fairly impressive snowboarding mechanic to keep things fresh. I enjoyed the saturated palette and the rubbery characters, but the voices and the writing are inescapably weak. Kaya Dark Lineage has a lot going for it, but the majority of the game isn't hugely special. This cartoony style was not unique to Dark Lineage. The platforming isn't mind-blowing, and the narrative is full of tonal whiplash to get the kids hyped up for video games. The combat system is great. Kaya can get a broad range of different Tekken-style attacks to use against the wolfen enemies that are fun to learn and always useful. Well, mostly always. The last 2 hours of Dark Lineage are an enormous mess, with horrific enemy imbalance, broken hitboxes, terrible physics, and an air of incompleteness all throughout. Enough of the game is good though, and so the game averages out to land among the more average titles in this ranking. '37th place goes to Shadow Ops Red Mercury, a game with cutscenes so bad that I genuinely couldn't get enough. Players take on the role of Captain Frank Hayden, a superstar soldier who is whisked away by the CIA to defeat a terrorist organization with the capability to manufacture suitcase-sized nuclear bombs. Hayden is sent across the world while on the hunt for the leadership of the organization, but things aren't as simple as they appear. Shadow Ops is as by the numbers as any post-millennium military shooter can be. The enemies are almost entirely regular humans, the weapons are bland, and most of the levels are set up as if the game had initially been conceived as an on-rail shooter, but was later changed to feature movement controls instead. Shadow Ops doesn't contain regenerating health, nor are there any vehicles to drive around or specified stealth mechanics. It's just a pure army man simulator with the most ridiculous story attached to it. So, as fun as the movies are, they are categorically bad. And the gameplay is inoffensive, but unimpressive. Shadow Ops Red Mercury is the true center of this list. Next, in 36th, is Eastern Exorcist, a 2021 2D action game developed by Chinese developer Wildfire Game. The game is split into two halves, one following the journey of vengeful demon hunter Liu as he tracks down the demon that killed his closest friends, while the other narrative follows Shui, the half-demon, as she attempts to rescue her brother from a terrible, magically inflicted coma. Eastern Exorcist isn't really a platformer, despite looking like one. It is supposed to mimic a Sekiro-style action game, and it does succeed in terms of presentation. The game has a heavy emphasis on boss encounters and parrying, which are mostly enjoyable. My reasoning for placing Eastern Exorcist here is primarily due to those big moments, as well as the game's split progression. There are so many bosses to battle that it actually starts to become stale, and the number of bosses that are just mediocre is far too high to justify many of them being present at all. The Blood Wizard that rides a fish is just not that exciting to fight, and yet it's one of the final encounters in Shui's campaign. And that choice to divide the game into two parts means that if the player chooses to play one narrative until it concludes before starting the next one, the difficulty of the entire game fully resets upon reaching the halfway point. The game has so effectively emulated Sekiro's atmosphere that it has been tagged as difficult on Steam, yet not only are neither of the campaigns actually challenging at all, any semblance of a challenge disappears at the midpoint. It's pretty, it's ambitious, but it isn't much beyond that. Game number 35 is a bit of a moral quandary for me, but I think that this is the highest I can place this game without feeling too much guilt. Shadow's Heretic Kingdoms is an action RPG developed by Slovakian developer Games Farm and was released in 2014. It was initially released as the first part of an episodic series, but the game's publisher went out of business before the second part was ready to release. As a result, Shadow's Heretic Kingdoms is an incomplete game, but it's still available for purchase. So that sucks. But what you do get is excellent. The setting of the Heretic Kingdoms is fascinating, with myriad humanoid races with distinct cultures to interact with, as well as the parallel dimension for magical entities known as the Dream. One mage, once a member of a cabal of powerful magic users, summons a demon within the Dream to assist in his escape from his former friend. This demon, the Devourer, has the power to assimilate souls into itself, allowing it to embody whomever it requires to complete its goals. These souls are characters for the player to use, essentially a party of various classes to use to progress through the world in order to help their mage summoner. The mechanics are great, it's extremely solid, and it is overflowing with variety. The narrative is intriguing and very mature for a video game plot, and I think the game's presentation is very impressive for such a small team. The problem is that the game is incomplete. There's another version of Shadow's Heretic Kingdoms out there, a finished one, and that game is superb. It's called Shadow's Awakening. Buy that, don't buy this. So far, I don't think I've ranked anything in a particularly controversial place, but this game might be where I see some disagreement. Portal is at 34th, Valve's 2007 puzzle game in which the player must solve puzzles that revolve around the iconic Portal gun. Portal has received continual acclaim since its release, and has attracted a rabid fanbase who are still enthusiastic about the game to this day. GLaDOS herself is also a fan favourite, although I presume mostly because of her Portal 2 appearance. For a game of its age, the presentation is still immaculate, and the Portal mechanic is well remembered for a reason. My issues with Portal stemmed from the game's pitiful runtime, and the aggressive amounts of hype that has been laid onto it. I finished Portal in less than 2 hours. There's barely any game here, especially considering how much is essentially tutorial. The latter stages rarely use the portals in new, compelling ways, and as things start to pick up in terms of pace, the credits start rolling. The game's fine. that's it. In 33rd is Digital Extreme's 2005 first-person shooter, Pariah. An attempt to capitalize on the success of Halo 2, Pariah is an action-packed science fiction adventure through an Earth-like planet with a wide selection of weapons, set pieces, vehicles, and enemies to battle with. Jack Mason, a military doctor, is transporting a cryogenically frozen patient to a large holding facility where the rare virus she has been infected with can be studied. While flying to the facility, Mason's aircraft is shot down by a faction of escaped prisoners, and he and his patient are left stranded in the forest. The patient's cryopod opens and she escapes into the forest alone, leaving Mason to pick up the pieces, find a means to get Corinna to the medical facility alive, and get revenge on the prisoners that got him into this mess. Pariah is mechanically fairly solid. The shooting is passable, and the enemies are interesting despite being very simple. Where the game shines is in its level design, containing some of the most vertically focused levels I've ever seen in a shooter of this style. The presentation is solid for the time too, meaning that the experience isn't too jarring overall for someone used to modern games. It is quite an ordinary game, however. There aren't any real highlights to find, nor does the game collapse into absolute garbage. The events that are observable as set pieces are generally very awkward and lack much of the spectacle that they really should contain. How Digital Extremes managed to make leaping between two planes in flight functional but unimpressive is quite paradoxical in my view. But at the same time, there's a lot of fun to be had with Pariah. Enemies will have no reservations about blowing themselves up if they can also manage to take the player down with them. They have no concept of slowing down when driving, and can chaotically careen off ledges at any moment. While these things are funny, their existence doesn't make the game great by any stretch. Another potentially controversial ranking is also the newest game on this list. Sable came out in September of 2021, developed by new studio Shedworks with music by Japanese Breakfast. Sable is an exploration video game, which I agonized over for a while before assigning. It borrows heavily from Breath of the Wild with the combat totally removed, which is certainly one way of addressing common criticisms of Zelda's combat. Players follow the titular Sable as she journeys through the world on her gliding, a coming-of-age journey where she finds her role in the world by experiencing it alone. She's given a jetbike to get around and sent out into the world to earn the mask she may wear for the rest of her life. The decision to abstain from any kind of combat or object collection or anything to provide any form of obstacle within the game's locations is utterly baffling to me. There's nothing beyond the visual spectacle in most locations, and if the player isn't impressed by what they've been shown, then the area is void to them. Not impressed by the two statues battling on a bridge? Well, there's nothing for you here. I found the majority of these locations to be the visual spectacle they intended, and the soundtrack is by far my favorite of all of the games in this ranking. But I don't believe that hoping the player is impressed by a new picturesque view every 15 minutes is a good idea to base your entire video game around. Sable is what it set out to be, and I will not refute that the game is very successful at that, hence its position in the list. But the game could have been so much more. Mundaun lands at 31st, another indie game released in 2021 with a striking visual style, though this time with a much darker tone than the previous game. Mundaun is a first-person survival horror game set on a Swiss mountaintop during a nebulous period of the mid-20th century. Kordin has returned to the village after receiving correspondence that his grandfather had passed away and that a funeral would be held for him shortly. That message also strangely warned Kordin to stay away from the village, but he chose to attend the funeral anyway. Upon arriving in the village, it is clear that something otherworldly caused his grandfather's death, and Kordin must find a means to undo the curse that has come to terrorize the tiny population. Mundaun is textured entirely using grey pencil. The game is entirely grayscale, with visible pencil markings on surfaces, which gives the game an impression of great professionalism. It's far easier to create object textures digitally, so the commitment to creating these visuals is definitely commendable. While Mundaun does a lot of things right, it relies entirely on its presentation to set it apart within the indie horror game landscape. It is narratively and mechanically fine, but fine only. The moment-to-moment gameplay includes strangely conflicting mechanics, like looking at monsters causing the screen to distort, while also arming the player with a gun to shoot at them. The narrative involves traveling back in time to undo a deal with the devil as the solution to the game's conflict. There's talking decapitated goat heads and evil beekeepers to offset the weak stuff, but the minimal puzzles, the simple combat, the excellent atmosphere with no actual scares, Mundaun is just above average as a video game product, unfortunately. '30th place goes to another horror-themed game, with the setting sometime in the past. Although Callisto Entertainment's 1998 PlayStation game Nightmare Creatures is set a few years before Mundaun. Nightmare Creatures is a rather sophisticated action game, filled with all forms of undead beasts and mutated horrors to slay, with one of the two playable characters' different movesets. Players are sent to hunt down disgraced scientist Adam Crowley as he unleashes an apocalyptic invasion on London, an army of twisted monstrosities created by his hand that the player must eradicate to progress through the city. Despite the game's singular city setting, I found the number of different environments to be quite impressive, and the game's presentation is very appealing to me as a fan of this style of video game graphics. Nightmare Creatures is often pointed to as a progenitor to From Software's Bloodborne, and I'd be interested to learn if anyone at From had played Nightmare Creatures prior to the creation of Bloodborne. Everything was set up to be an excellent game, but in an effort to keep the game's pace high and steer the game toward a more horror-like atmosphere, Callisto chose to include an ever-decreasing adrenaline bar that kills the player if it ever totally empties. The bar is refilled whenever the player defeats an enemy, but I'd argue that the game's atmosphere is actually ruined by this mechanic instead of enhanced by it. It quickly becomes frustrating when long portions of levels contain few to no enemies, and this bar slowly ticks towards the player's death, when a location that lacks any enemy presence should really be the safest place for a player to be. The game also becomes unreasonably difficult towards the end, as healing items and extra lives become rarer and rarer, and the enemies become healthier and healthier. I'd recommend playing Nightmare Creatures just to see it, but maybe don't worry about seeing the ending. The oldest game I've played so far is 1986's Metroid for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The first in Nintendo's legendary series, Metroid sees Samus Aran's first adventure to destroy the galactic menace known as Mother Brain, and her army of parasitic Metroids. This game is iconic, and the series returns to this first setting almost every time for good reason. The world design is absurdly good. Nintendo managed to get so much right on their first attempt, which is ridiculously impressive. Things are a little rough visually, but again, this game is running on 8-bit hardware and was released in the 80s, so the blackness and the awkward animations are forgivable in my view. There's a good chunk of game here, and it's well worth trying if you like games similar to this, to see where it all comes from. Despite clearly being a classic, Metroid doesn't hold up too well today. Samus's airspeed is too slow to string platform movements together, so the game never flows well. And the shooting mechanics are fine, but they're very basic. There are a lot of different types of projectiles, and the ability to aim straight upward is necessary in some locations due to the platform layouts. Kraid and Ridley are underwhelming encounters. They don't act like enemies, more like hazards with a health pool. You play Metroid for the world design, and while it is good, it isn't flawless. There are too many false walls, most with nothing behind them, but enough of consequence that the player will have to check every dead end just in case. It rarely gets tedious, but having to spend the time shooting walls, combined with the time inputting passwords on death, makes the latter half of Metroid unfriendly and slow. Still, a decent game though. Play it, but with save states. Next, at 28th, is Lair, a game that sold so poorly that the developer and publisher went out of business after its release. Lair is an air combat game in which the player flies upon a dragon, fighting massive pitched battles against a similarly armed enemy force. While he was raised to believe his homeland is superior to their northern counterpart, Rune soon learns that his religious leader isn't as righteous as he initially appeared. With the despicable assassination of the leadership of both nations at the hands of his own Skyguard cohort, Rune is asked to betray his morals to appeal to his nationalism. Factor 5 had intended for Lair to be a launch title for the PlayStation 3, so they put the system's 6-axis function front and center to deliver a true next-gen flight experience. The motion controls were controversial at the time, but I found them to be surprisingly enjoyable. They're responsive and natural, and never require the player to make uncomfortable movements. What really causes the game to land in the lower half of the rankings is a mixture of the game's visuals and level design. As an early HD game, Lair relies a lot on its high-poly models to separate it from those previous system games. The textures and animations of characters are generally quite ugly, but the environments are the biggest failures. As fun as the flight gameplay is, without obstacles to necessitate using the maneuvers, there may as well not be an environment at all. While there are battles with obstructions in the environment, they're all brown, grey, and empty. I do like the game, I just wish it weren't so ugly. The second Super Nintendo game to appear on this ranking is F-Zero, the first in Nintendo's science fiction racing series that was also a launch title for their 16-bit home console. Designed as a means to show off the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 function, F-Zero also aimed to deliver the arcade racing experience to the console audience. No other game had simulated 3D as effectively as F-Zero, and the utilization of Mode 7 is still impressive to this day. And the music. F-Zero music is so good. Of course, the most important part of any racing game are the tracks and vehicles. And while F-Zero has a measly 4 cars to choose from, it does at least have a decent selection of tracks. F-Zero's main issues come at the cost of it being the first of its kind. The game isn't very mechanically dense, and some features that seem necessary are just absent. I think there are 2 vehicles that are objectively better than the other 2 on every track. This is offset by the Blue Falcon also being the coolest vehicle, but it doesn't help with the lack of diversity. The game also doesn't allow the player to select every track to play during time trial mode. Arguably the most enjoyable mode in the game only has about half of the tracks available to race on, but the game does keep track of times set during the Grand Prix. So in order to set a better time on some tracks, the player has to commit to multiple other tracks to get an attempt. There are a lot of good reasons to play F-Zero, but you'll most likely not be playing for long. In 26th is the third-person shooter sequel to John Carpenter's 1982 film, The Thing. The game was developed by Computer Artworks, which quickly went under after The Thing's release, in 2002, for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC. I played the PlayStation 2 version and was absolutely floored by the game's first impressions. The first level is set in the ruins of Outpost 31, only days after the film's conclusion, and the atmosphere is tremendous. Considering this game released 20 years ago now, it's hugely impressive that the atmosphere and presentation hold up so well. I like the character models a lot, and there's a bunch of cool things being done with the sound design to really sell the horror aesthetic. I also really liked the imposter mechanic, wherein NPC allies the player can collect can turn out to be thing creatures in disguise, although the option to test them to see if they were human or not was an unfortunately misplaced system. The player will also get access to a wide range of weapons to fight the creatures off with, which sees them becoming quite a bit stronger than the enemy. But the game geniusly disarms the player at one stage, and asks them to deal with multiple thing enemies without weapons at all. While the excellent atmosphere holds throughout the majority of the game, and those minor mechanical systems can mostly be ignored, the thing kind of falls apart towards the end. A human villain is rushed in to give the game some more characters to work with, and the underwater base causes the performance to buckle, and the burning tower escape sequence is atrocious. And the final boss is somehow worse than all of that. But the majority of the game is such an intense, fascinating ride that I can't bring myself to be too hard on the missteps. I'd say give this game a shot. It's probably great on an emulator. The next game is another third-person horror game, and another Digital Extremes game. Dark Sector follows the exploits of CIA operative Hayden Tenno as he is deployed to the country of Lazria to eliminate a rogue agent. Lazria is currently in the midst of a horrific viral outbreak, and despite Hayden's vaccination, he is still infected, forcefully. The consequences of the infection for Hayden cause his arm to transform, allowing him to summon a knived boomerang that the game calls a glaive. The consequences for everyone else is that they are transformed into zombies and other similar monsters, providing a surprising range of enemies to battle throughout the game. Digital Extremes uses the abandoned city environments to create some fantastic atmosphere, and some of the enemy interactions with the environment can be incredible. Dark Sector is narratively very weak, has some technical problems, and isn't mechanically diverse enough to differentiate it from other similar games. The rogue CIA operative and the virus are linked in potentially the most extreme way. Some kind of hive mind thing. It's not very interesting, but it's set up like it is. The enemy scripting broke a few times during my playthrough. Sometimes they'd stand in the open for no reason, other times they'd slide around without animating. And in the video, I compared the game to Resident Evil 4 quite openly, because it seems to be shadowing that game quite aggressively. But I like Resident Evil, so I'm not too opposed to it. The 24th spot goes to what is ostensibly a demo for a later game, although not quite as morally upsetting as the previous mention. Eventide Sigil is Oleander Garden's 2020 entry into their Hexcraft series, and functions as more of a scavenger hunt instead of any other genre I could think to assign. The player enters the world without much of a clue what their goals are, but after exploring some of the available locations, and after talking with the knights stationed around, they'll come across a relic. These items are the keys to the final location, so collecting them all is the path forward. Those knights are also on the hunt, and the player is very unlikely to be able to collect everything before a knight manages to pick up a relic, so the player will have to arm themselves and take the other relics by force. The game ends after the player reaches the final zone, and since there are only a handful of relics to collect, the game doesn't tend to be very long. The entire experience is so unlike anything else I had played before that point, and despite being disappointed at the game's short length, I still found it to be a satisfying experience. So while the game is fascinating, it was clearly a demo for an expanded version. The small number of relics and knights makes the game very difficult to replay too, since the player would already know where everything is and how to get there quickly. I can definitely recommend playing Eventide Sigil just to see what Godin is doing, but I won't be playing it again. Aurion, Legacy of the Kori-Odan is Cameroon's first narrative video game, and lands at 23rd in my rankings. Aurion is a 2D beat-em-up style action game that was released in 2016 by Kori-Odan Games on PC, making it the only West African game not available on phones. The game follows the king of Zamar, Enzo Kori-Odan, and his wife Erin, after their kingdom is stolen from them by an invading army equipped with the power of an Aurion. The two are exiled from their home, and must find a way to gain their own Aurionic power to retake their city. Things aren't so simple though, as after many travels throughout the rest of the world, Enzo and Erin meet with the Bojar tribe, a powerful military force that quietly seeks world conquest through magical schemes, including taking control of Zamar. Enzo experiences multiple Aurionic awakenings throughout the journey, adding new, flashy elemental attacks to his arsenal, and creating one of the broadest movesets I've ever seen on a video game protagonist. Enzo will need it to be able to defeat all of the bosses in their way. For a game from a studio without the resources of developers in the established video game industry, Aurion, Legacy of the Kori-Odan is the dream product. It has everything a good game needs, but it's quite rough around the edges. The amalgamated triple engine causes some issues with performance, particularly right at the end of the game too, which leaves an unfortunate taste as the final impression. Similarly, things just aren't as well tested toward the back end. Some of the UI pieces are blank, some of the encounters are far too easy, while others are far too hard. It's still worthwhile playing, but the game just doesn't have that magical quality that elevates it beyond its flaws. Mirror's Edge is up next. DICE's first-person platformer didn't blow too many people away when it was released back in 2008, but the game gained a committed cult following that still sells the game's quality to this day. Parkour was the latest fad activity, and a huge EA studio decided to try and capture the experience of speedily scaling obstacles across an urban environment. And in many ways, I think they succeeded. Faith's movements and acrobatic abilities are exhilarating, and leaping from rooftop to rooftop gives the appropriate sense of vertigo. The story is bad, and anytime the level has the player on the ground, the game isn't quite as great as it is while on the rooftops. But DICE absolutely nailed the parkour gameplay, which earns the game's longevity itself. I don't believe that a game requires a narrative to be great, but Mirror's Edge's story is so atrocious that I think it brings the game down in my view. Despite being created by DICE, the Battlefield developers, the gunplay in Mirror's Edge is also a detriment, and often those gunning sections are placed in the game's least interesting environments to make them even less appealing. Faith's escapades against the militarized police force include a grand total of 7 characters, many of whom are killed or exist only as blindingly obvious red herrings for the side plot about a secret rival. And the faceless city police are just some obstacle to overcome, despite having attack helicopters to spend on a single person running through some scaffolding. DICE didn't take the opportunity to have a rival gang get involved, and instead wanted to force the player onto the ground where they'd have to shoot at the police with the game's terrible shooting. If the parkour gameplay weren't so immaculate, I probably would have really disliked Mirror's Edge, so it's a blessing that the key aspect of the game is so good. I played the Wii port of Pikmin in 2021, Nintendo's console-friendly RTS that sees Captain Olimar utilizing the titular Pikmin to collect pieces of his crashed spaceship in order to return home. This game seems as though it was made for the Wii's pointer function, as the aiming reticle for Pikmin placement is just a seamless and natural concept that anyone could intuit with little prerequisite RTS skills. The game is characterful, colourful, and is likely Nintendo's riskiest venture that actually paid off. The Pikmin are the stars of the show, as the player is able to command a squad of up to 100 of the little guys to complete all of the tasks to retrieve the spaceship parts. The elemental variation and having to collect a food resource to generate more Pikmin are the only strategic elements to the game, however. And while the player can do some things to speed up battles against dangerous enemies, the mechanical depth of Pikmin is disappointing. After the blue Pikmin is introduced to counter water obstacles, the game has nowhere else to go. The final gauntlet level contains some water, some fire, some bombs, and a boss. And since the player can bank Pikmin in other levels and bring them here, there's little else to do than just smash down the meager defenses of the big Bulborb. The game's 8-hour runtime is essentially filled with solved problems by the second hour. I enjoyed finishing the levels, in that satisfying way in which you already know the solution to the puzzle and it's just about inserting the answer. But I don't think it's wrong to want more depth from the game. I guess that's why they made sequels. In 20th, and the halfway point of this video, is Rune, Human Head Studios' 2000 3D hack-and-slash set in Midgard as the coming of Ragnarok looms over the land. Ragnar, the newest member of his tribe's warrior caste, is sent with the rest of the forces to investigate the claim that someone is destroying sacred runestones. The claim turns out to be true, and they are intercepted by the perpetrators. Konrak has fallen to the temptations of Loki, and is endeavouring to destroy the runestone, free Loki from his prison, and allow all hell to break loose in Midgard. Konrak summons a lightning strike to destroy Ragnar's boat, casting the entire army into the water. Ragnar doesn't immediately drown, and instead he is called downward to an underground cavern. There, a vision of Odin greets Ragnar, and chooses him as Midgard's champion. Ragnar must then single-handedly take down all of Loki and Konrak's forces to save the world. Despite recently being accepted into the warrior caste of his village, Ragnar is skilled with any weapon he can find, so the player will get a fair selection of tools to clobber enemies with. Rune is a really great game while you're playing it. Combat is always a chaotic joy, and the level design is fantastic for the most part. But when I stepped back from the game, I found some holes. The 3 boss battles in the game are all terrible. Both fights against Konrak are just damage races. The first one is also kind of buggy, and the second fight lacks the numbers to even really have a damage race against. The Dwarf King has a mechanic that involves pressing buttons and travelling through portals, but it just doesn't work. It's tedious, and it lacks the proper build-up. And while Konrak is clearly the game's main villain, he's barely present throughout the whole thing. It makes sense. He's not going to be harassing Ragnar while he's climbing out of hell, but some scenes where we check in to see what Konrak is up to would definitely help give him more presence. In the grand scheme of the game, these things are minor issues that are easily ignored. When you come for Viking hack and slash and you get it, what more can you ask for? Next up, Lionhead Studios' 2005 management game, The Movies, in which players are given the keys to a film lot and are solely responsible for hiring and managing staff, construction of all buildings and sets, decorations, and they can even script the movies themselves and see their staff create the films in real time. The game is surprisingly deep, with every staff type having experience levels in their respective roles. Actors and directors take this 5 steps further, by having genre-specific skills, relationships, PR appearances, and their fashion and physical appearance stats are tracked too. This might seem overwhelming, and in the late game it definitely is, but throughout the majority of the game, these mechanics are fed to the player at a comfortable pace that make the game highly compelling. I like the palette a lot, and the character models are very good for the time, and the music and voice work round the game's presentation to an unbelievably high level. The game's main issue is, strangely, poor balance. The number of staff the player is able to hire is far too small to actually keep things running effectively, with the vast majority arriving right at the start of the playthrough. So, by the time the 70s roll around, most of the actors and directors will be approaching their retirement, and replacements don't arrive in plentiful enough quantity to keep things moving. Moreover, there are awards to win every few in-game years that provide certain buffs to the player, one of which is so strong that it can tailor how the player's entire studio runs, and losing it once can cause the whole playthrough to collapse into itself. It's so easy to sink hours into the movies without noticing, but eventually it ends in catastrophe. Garden's second entry on this ranking is their 2019 release, Pagan Autogeny. The game takes place within a dead MMO called Plaza 96, as the player Vivian returns to see what it has become. Vivian finds that it's a bleak shell of the game it once was, but something about the mystery keeps Vivian engaged. The grumbling monster deep within the Transworld Station, and the Venus de Milo labelled the Martyr are Plaza's secrets, while Vivian's stats and the tarot cards are autogenies. Vivian's stat line includes things like her poetry levels, her caffeine levels, her murder levels, and more importantly, body forging and estrogen levels. Pagan Autogeny is about the transgender experience far more than it is about finding life within a long-abandoned MMO. And from an outsider's perspective, this metaphor has to be the most intriguing means to disseminate this information. From selecting a video game avatar that isn't representative of one's sex assigned at birth, to the magical powers of tarot, the thick haze that blankets suburbia, and the literal construction of a more desirable body. Autogeny touches on a lot of the shared experiences of many within the trans community, without explicitly spelling things out to a deaf audience. It's dignified, and it's genius. It's also very short, and unfortunately far too cryptic to be reasonably completed by a single person. There are 5 pieces of the mannequin to find, and only a handful more items that are required to see a secret ending. Those items are easily found once the player notices some of the enemies can be farmed for drops, so both endings can be seen within a couple hours at most. This isn't necessarily a negative, as the game's length is not indicative of its quality, and I find that I'm much more lenient to solo developers in regard to the quantity of content within their games. But Autogeny asks the player to rub their faces against the surfaces to try to find everything, and then the payoff comes and then it's over. I wouldn't call it an anticlimax, but considering how deep the player has to dive to find those last cards, I would have hoped for a little more at the end. It's a similar issue to Eventide Sigil that Garden has since rectified. '17th goes to the Eternal Castle, a cinematic platformer that makes the CGA graphic style look like a stylistic choice rather than a technical limitation. Released on Steam in 2019, the Eternal Castle runs for less than 2 hours in total, presumably inspiring the developers to fabricate the story of the game's origins during the 80s. Within that short length is the adventure of a human sent back to Earth to retrieve a rogue android that didn't return. Upon entering Earth's atmosphere, the player's craft is shot from the sky, and the pieces scatter across the land. With nothing but a stationary teleporter and their own 2 fists, The player must retrieve the pieces of their ship and then go to wherever the android is to take it back home. The cinematic platformer featured rotoscoped animations of a human character doing the actions within their human limits. The original Prince of Persia and Out of This World were the jumping off points for the Eternal Castle's fluid animations, although the game does feature some 3D objects to sweeten the style. The combat is surprisingly brutal as a result, as the punches and kicks are heavy and give the sensation of actually trying to punch someone, as opposed to spawning a damage zone in front of the character. The music is tremendous, and the ending is spectacular. It's very, very short though, and the game often crowds many of its rooms with a few too many enemies in my opinion. As much as I'd love to recommend the Eternal Castle, $15 dues is at least 50% more than I can reasonably advocate. The presentation is phenomenal, and there are some truly special moments within the gameplay, but it needed another world or two. I'd love for this development team to create another game like this, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Dishonored is a game that I think really should have made it higher up this ranking, but after thinking about it further, I just couldn't justify having it above some of the games left to talk about. Corvo, the bodyguard of the Empress of Dunwall, has returned from a nearby ally to try and learn if they've been dealing with a rat-carried plague, and if so, how they've gone about resolving the plight. When he goes to meet with the Empress and her daughter, a mysterious group teleports in, assassinates the Empress, and kidnaps her daughter before teleporting away again. The Dunwall guards arrive to see Corvo alone, standing over the Empress's body. Corvo is taken to be the perpetrator, arrested and set to death for the crime. Before he can be executed, Corvo is granted a means to escape prison and flee to a helpful group of Corvo loyalists. The game then turns to finding a means to clear Corvo's name, while also taking out political opponents of those who helped Corvo escape prison. As the Empress's bodyguard, Corvo is a highly capable combatant, able to use any weapon he gets a hold of, as well as become virtually invisible to anyone who would hunt him. Eventually, Corvo gains magical abilities too, so the player gets to play in even more ways than were already available to them. Just seeing what you can do in Dishonored earns it a huge quantity of credit in my eyes. The reason it doesn't make the top 10 is because the narrative is appalling, and the game dedicates a lot of attention to it. There are extensive briefing and debriefing segments between each mission, as well as the occasional narrative break mid-mission, and yet half of it feels like an afterthought. Arcane were a subsidiary of ZeniMax by this stage, so their team was likely to be filled with highly talented people, and yet the game shipped with this story. The rat plague feels tacked on and contrived, and the game seems to forget about it constantly and then have to remind the player that it's still around. Additionally, the way the game's main villain is defeated is really stupid, and the final infighting battle comes out of nowhere with no motivation and no clear purpose. The plan just collapses at the end, and there are rats. The sneaking around is really good though, and the combat is great. In 15th, the best game I'd never recommend. While there are ethical reasons to avoid playing the Void, the suffering at the player's expense makes the game one of the least fun experiences I've ever had with a video game. Created by Icepick Lodge as a follow-up to their similarly polarizing game Pathologic, the Void is a bleak depiction of a purgatory without hope of escape. The player character is sustained by a substance known as color, a resource that is available in two forms, lympha and nerva, which can also be shared with others as a desperate attempt to leave. Lympha is the raw form and is found across a variety of nodes throughout Purgatory. The player needs to consume lympha constantly, else they'll die from starvation, and they do that by assigning collected lympha to their organs to process. Processed lympha becomes nerva, which can then be used to refresh lympha nodes, or as a weapon to combat enemies. The reinvigoration of purgatory at the player's hand attracts the Brothers, entities of destruction who have come to ravish this land before disappearing deeper into the darkness. The player must manage their color reserves while also ensuring the Brothers don't catch on to their plan to leave. Things get more stressful as the Brothers discover the player's actions and begin attacking them, or torturing the sisters for information, and the general tone of the game is downright miserable. The metaphor and the intention to create discomfort in the player is undoubtedly successful though, and while the game isn't ever fun to play, it's still compelling and genuinely a masterfully assembled piece. Not only is the setting nebulous and unsettling, but the gameplay mechanics are arranged to reinforce those emotions. The Brothers can drain a location of the color the player has been cultivating there, and the movements on the map screen are relatively unpredictable, so there's always the threat of losing some valuable investment and failing the next battle. Combat doesn't occur in a way that's immediately understandable. For the most part, the player applies some color to the enemies, with the quantity used determining the damage that is dealt. There are signs the player can learn to draw, creating more powerful attacks with different properties to damage the enemies with. When in battle then, the player will be faced with a monstrous brother and have to deal damage to them with their own health essentially. Resources get extremely tight toward the back end of the game, as brother attacks become more frequent and the sisters start to also require nerva themselves. I think it goes way too far, but if you really want something distressing to play for 25 hours or so, then the Void is certainly an option. Fourteenth is a game that is criminally unavailable in most regions worldwide, Marlow Briggs and the Mask of Death. A Slovenian spectacle fighter that isn't actually available for purchase in Slovenia, Marlow Briggs follows the titular hero's mission to rescue his archaeologist girlfriend from the hands of her maniacal, Mayan relic-fueled employer and his private army. Kim Long chartered an archaeological expedition to some Mayan ruins, and hired Eva Torres to conduct the translations of any artifact they come across. Smoke jumper Marlow Briggs decides to visit his girlfriend at the dig, where she expresses dissatisfaction at the treatment of the site by Long's other staff. Marlow encourages her to quit, and the two confront Long before they intend to leave. Things escalate, and Marlow is impaled by one of Long's henchmen, while Eva is taken against her will. As Long's army leaves the site, a mask makes its way to Marlow's abandoned body. The mask revives Marlow into the chosen warrior, and the two team up to take down Long and save Eva. At release, the game was criticized for being too similar to the original God of War trilogy, and I don't deny that is most definitely true. But God of War was a PlayStation exclusive series, a platform which did not host Marlow Briggs, so I think it's fine. The stupidly massive scale, the flashy combos, the dumb humor, and the surprising enemy variety make Marlow Briggs far too special to disparage by comparing it to something else. It isn't a whole lot beyond those descriptions though. Marlow and the mask banter, and it's fun, but the characters don't go further than surface level. Marlow wants Eva back. Long wants power. They're working towards those goals. And whenever the player unlocks a new weapon, the game shows Marlow using it in these 1 frame every 2 second movies, in which Marlow emotionlessly hits enemies with the new weapon form. But these are the deepest depths this game falls to. Everything else is either acceptable or spectacular. The level designs are surprisingly varied, and the scale and themes of the levels are absurd and awesome. I liked the majority of the bosses, and Marlow's moveset is massive and a lot of fun too. It's well worth playing, even if you have to get a key from a reseller or something. Castlevania, The classic NES game gets the 13th position on my ranking. Konami's 1986 horror platformer is infamous for its difficulty and relentlessness. The player must battle their way through 18 stages, 6 bosses, and even take on Dracula himself in order to banish the evil from the land. Dracula's forces are varied and plentiful, but with whip in hand and access to some additional special weapons, Simon Belmont can defeat the Prince of Darkness. Simon's ground controls are nice and snappy, but things get committed whenever Simon leaves the ground, causing the platforming to be uniquely challenging. Furthermore, the whip attack involves a wind-up before the damage-dealing portion appears, forcing the player to be more mindful of when they attack enemies in their path. These controls, combined with the game's excellent level design and enemy placements, makes Castlevania deeply memorable, and one of the NES's most legendary games. I spent 8 hours playing Castlevania when I played it back in February of 2021, and while I definitely enjoyed the time spent, those 8 hours basically wrung the game dry. There aren't continues or save points. Whenever you get a game over, you need to restart the entire game. This meant I became very familiar with the whole thing, front to back. I'm happy about it. It's a great game. But once I was done, I was done. If you haven't played Castlevania, go do that. I just liked other games more. Probably another controversial pick, although for the opposite reasons as before. I'm putting Devil's Third in 12th, partly because I feel like being a contrarian about it, but also because I genuinely think this game is unreasonably fun. Devil's Third is a 2015 third-person shooter, released exclusively for the Wii U, outside of Japan anyway. Valhalla Game Studios' first and currently only game was directed by Tomonobu Itagaki, of Dead or Alive and the reboot Ninja Gaiden series. Devil's Third follows the exploits of a former bioterrorist, codenamed Ivan, as he is let out of Guantanamo Bay to deal with a planetary existential level threat that only he is capable of stopping. Ivan is incredibly athletic and highly trained at using most weapons he comes across. He also never wears a shirt or takes his sunglasses off because he's way too cool. The forces that Ivan has been sent to combat were capable of destroying satellites and triggering an electromagnetic pulse that took almost all electronics offline across the entire world. Ivan is sent to Panama, where the group are attacking a facility near the canal. It's there he learns that this organization are his former co-conspirators, and their plans involve much more than simply attacking the Panama Canal. Despite the inclusion of horrific chemical weapons and barbaric scientific experiments, Devil's Third keeps its tone light and silly, with plenty of wacky surprises around every corner. Mechanically, the game is very sound. The shooting and melee combat both feature fantastic feedback, and the balance is perfect. The game's challenging, but it's never cheap. Devil's Third isn't flawless. There are some technical problems here and there, and as gigantic as the stakes are, the level themes don't quite match that ridiculousness. Compared to how big the Marlow Briggs settings were, I can't help but think Valhalla missed an opportunity to go all out. And the choices they did make weren't always ideal. Some environments just aren't optimized very well, and there are occasionally problems with textures loading in slowly. These problems are likely due to the game's publisher troubles and the constant shifting between platforms. I can discount them, and I think anyone else playing Devil's Third should too. It's camp, it's unconcerned about appealing to the tropes of the time. It's a good game. Just missing out on a top 10 spot is The Guardian Legend, an NES hybrid action game developed by Compile that was released in 1988. Players are sent down to an abandoned planet to see if they can discover what has happened to the previous inhabitants. The player character is known as the Guardian, a humanoid robot who is able to transform into a ship when needed, and the adventure is similarly assembled to facilitate this ability. The on-ground segments take place in a vast maze with enemies to stand in the player's way as they search for doors to the next area. Eventually, the player will come across a corridor into the center of the planet. These are the shoot-'em-up segments, with excellent enemy and thematic variety, and usually an interesting boss at the end. I compared the game to Nier Automata, as they share the same genre mix, and even some of the themes are similar, like the android protagonist and the planet that is no longer inhabited by humans. The controls are responsive, the action is smooth, and the world is full of nooks to poke around in for rewards. Plus, you get to battle against an enemy called the Crawdaddy, which most certainly boosts the game's ranking at least 10 or so places. Unfortunately, my Crawdaddy couldn't carry the Guardian Legend too high. I found that once the games with glaring flaws were set out and sorted, the higher into the ranking I got, the more time I spent agonizing over the qualities that separate one game from another. How highly do I value certain aspects of a game? What about the mechanics makes them more valuable than a decently effective narrative? Or does the narrative totally outweigh all other aspects if done exceptionally? These questions were often unkind to the Guardian Legend. I really like the setting, but there isn't any kind of narrative here at all. The sprites are some of the most complex I've seen on the NES, especially for 1988, but the hardware is actively hurting the game here. It isn't an ugly game, but it is quite plain comparatively, and the hardware is impacting it here again. Similarly, the controller can only allow for so much. While there are a lot of power-ups to use, and two entirely different gameplay styles, the Guardian Legend just falls short of the other games I've yet to speak about. If you have ever been interested in NES games, play the Guardian Legend. It's easily one of the best games on the system. So that was ranks 45 to 11. If you've been with me the whole time, I really appreciate it. But now we're getting into the juicy stuff. Top 10, bottom 5. If you skipped ahead to this point, welcome. It's been a journey. I hope your index finger didn't get sprained when you clicked the time code. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Ranked 10th is Folklore, Game Republic's 2007 action RPG for the PlayStation 3. Folklore follows the events of two characters' adventures in a small Irish coastal village called Doolin. The two arrive separately, but the events that occur within the village cause them to cross paths frequently. Ellen has travelled to Doolin upon receiving a note from her long-deceased mother asking Ellen to meet her there, while Keats is summoned from his Supernatural Sightings magazine office by a distressed person via a telephone call. They arrive roughly at the same time, and are timely enough to witness a woman fall to her death from a nearby cliff. Distressed by this dramatic introduction to the village, both characters struggle to sleep through the night, and end up making their way to the local pub, which just so happens to be filled with magical creatures from a parallel dimension called the Netherworld. Such begins the adventures of Folklore, as Ellen dons a ceremonial Celtic dress and works towards reaching a location called the Netherworld Core for her ally the Fairy Lord, while Keats tags along with Lavon, as she endeavours to prevent the Fairy Lord from ever reaching the core. The thing that really sets Folklore apart is the combat system. Ellen and Keats have no combat abilities themselves. Instead, they capture the essence of the enemies they encounter, and summon them as their attacks. This makes every enemy in the game function as part of the player character's combat moveset, allowing for a diverse range of combat options for both characters, and keeping things from getting stale between them. The game does require the player to play through most levels twice, once with each character, and it can feel tedious to do so. Furthermore, the game does have some technical hitches, as being part of the PlayStation 3 library should indicate, and there is the occasional cliché anime writing moment throughout the narrative because apparently characters can never be motivated by anything beyond a mysterious past, or needlessly withholding valuable information from each other for dramatic reasons alone. The dumb stuff, you know. But if these things were really so bad, I don't think I'd still vividly remember this game as well as I do. I played Folklore way back in February of 2021. I've played more than 40 other games since then, and yet I can recall enemies, environments, and the entire plot without issue. It has thoroughly embedded itself in my mind, and I think that's because of the quality of Folklore's design. Game Republic made that real-time Pokemon game people have always been clamoring for, and I cannot wait to play more of their games in the future. In ninth is the latest Oleander Garden game, Hexcraft Harlequin Fair. Garden returns to Vivian, her lead from Autogeny, to explore a hyper-condensed Toronto in a gameplay style very reminiscent of Eventide Sigil. That means it's a scavenger hunt with some first-person shooting mechanics, and this time it's brilliant. These environments are filled with secrets to find and surprises to stumble upon, as well as upgrades and new weapons to play with further along. Some places are overflowing with enemies. Others are patrolled by neutral entities who will fight the enemies if the two encounter each other. Killing people, collecting items, learning the secrets of the city, all influence a hidden reputation stat that causes people to interact with the player differently. Sometimes the mall is safe, sometimes the Hot Topic vampires might not be so tolerant to you snooping around and attack you on sight. But to take the whole game at face value would be to engage with Garden's work incorrectly. The undead are found all across Toronto, but so are angels and a church full of holy warriors. Heaven has descended onto the city's streets to combat the darkness crawling up from the depths. The public are succumbing to the temptations of necromancy, and the local Chinese triad are gearing up for something big. Amidst this, Vivian is having a crisis of identity and can collect persona discs from her fellows to see if they're a good fit. Harlequin Fair is cryptic and obscure, yet it's so easy to play. Sure, there are dead ends, but a quick tour through another location could hold the power required to carry on exploring. There are podiums that ask for specific items that are found frequently while searching, and the moment something important appears in the player's inventory becomes a mad dash to see what was behind that door. Summoning entities from hell in a video game has never felt more like an ordeal, and the following consequences of doing so are just as disastrous as you'd expect. No, the demons won't steal your soul or try to manipulate you into doing its bidding. It's a hulking monster that just fell into your lap. It's gonna slap you around and cause some chaos. Harlequin Fair is a riveting excursion through a twisted city, and I really need to play the new content that was released not long ago. Fifth worst and 46th overall is Space Hulk: Vengeance of the Blood Angels, a first-person adaptation of Games Workshop's Space Hulk board game that was released for PC, the original PlayStation, and Sega's Saturn console, the latter of which I played. Vengeance of the Blood Angels sees a crew of Blood Angels Terminators enter a Hulk for the usual flimsy reasoning, and they are inevitably attacked by Gene Stealers. The player controls the entire squad in real time, issuing orders from an overhead map screen or transferring between each Terminator to reposition them manually. The Gene Stealers are fast and deadly, and will hide around corners and then leap out at unpredictable timings, which is genuinely very impressive. The Terminators are generally hopeless in hand-to-hand combat with the Gene Stealers, so ensuring clear sightlines and well-guarded flanks is mandatory to make any progress through the Hulk. I like the renders of the Gene Stealers and the Terminators, though the other enemy types are poor in comparison, and the mission briefing room is one of the worst environment renders I've ever seen. The soundscape is primarily silence, and only broken by the badly compressed Genestealer or Blood Angel screams during combat, and the shooting mechanics are nothing more than pressing the shoot button and watching the projectile fly. As an adaptation of the board game, Vengeance of the Blood Angels fails to satisfy in either category it has attempted to pursue. There are too few options to make any tactical moves, and often the player will be trapped in the only safe position, as infinitely spawning waves of Genestealers continually harass them, failing to offer moments of reprise for the player to make a dash to the next safe zone. And as a first-person shooter, the game's slow turning speed and lack of any variation in shooting mechanics makes it boring very quickly. I think the idea of a first-person shooter with tactical elements has been done excellently since 1995, but a tactical game with FPS elements is bound to fail. It'll always be clunky and awkward, and considering the first-person shooter was still in its infancy at this point, it seems like combining it with such a vastly different genre was only asking for trouble. It's slow, it's monotonous, it's not worth your time. Eighth best, although saying it out loud certainly seems wrong, is Dujana, Jack King Spooner's 2017 handcrafted narrative adventure. King Spooner is a physical artist, a capable musician, filmmaker, and video game developer. And in Dujana, all of these talents are on display. Players follow Dujana herself around the world as she searches for closure. Her husband and daughter had gone to the desert to bury the deceased family pet, but they never returned. Dujana mourns for a while before her loss of purpose finally catches up with her. With nothing and nobody to live for, Dujana heads out into the world, nominally for closure, but also in search of a means to overcome her existential decline. This leads her to wandering the desert, seeing the world, and learning about the various conflicts that are affecting the lives of the rest of her community. The game's visuals are primarily constructed from physical objects, Allen keys, pipe cleaners, wires, and putty, and the resulting presentation is unlike anything I had seen before. Dujana explores a wide range of very mature topics, particularly in regards to the topics video games tend to cover. During the opening, King Spooner explicitly states that the game is about existentialism, but as the game progresses, the topics broaden to morality, foreign occupation, art, and the strongest theme in my view, grief. Much of the world is stuck worrying about the future, worrying about inevitabilities like death and interpersonal conflict, and the player gets to explore these things unannounced. You never know when you'll stumble upon something silly or something heavy, and I think that unpredictability helps the moments of seriousness to be more impactful. Dujana overall is a little lacking in gameplay highlights, but that doesn't disqualify the product overall. And I don't think you sign up to play Dujana for ultra gamer moments anyway. The next game, 7th overall, is Cult Heretic Kingdoms, Games Farm's 2004 action role-playing game, and the first set in the Heretic Kingdoms universe. Cult follows the story of Alita, an apprentice mage who has been brought into the ranks of the Inquisition to assist in the purging of religious idolatry and practice throughout the land. A great war had been fought over this, and the victors have taken it upon themselves to ensure that all of their subjects refrain from turning to deities at any moment. Whilst searching through an abandoned monastery, Alita learns that the weapon used to claim victory over religion, the Godslayer sword, has been stolen, and a secret organization is seeking to use the sword's power to resurrect their god. This plot goes far above her mentor's head, and so Alita is whisked into the ranks of the kingdom's leaders. It's here that she learns of the true nature of the world, how the parallel universe known as the Dream is ever present, and eventually, that everyone she trusts is in some way yearning to gain the power of the Godslayer sword for themselves. Cult is an isometric action role-playing game in a similar vein to Diablo. It has a much more narrative focus though, and doesn't allow the player to become too strong for the enemies to handle. The Slovakian developer created the entire game from scratch. The engine is bespoke, the art is often hand-drawn, and they even managed to get Tom Baker to voice the narrator lines, which is an impressive feat for such a small team. This game does have some weaknesses. It's fairly simple, the balance is very weird, and there are moments that seem to come out of nowhere as far as the story goes. But I often found these flaws to be oxymoronically charming. Getting bum rushed by 30 enemies in a tiny room seems like an example of terrible game design, and I don't disagree that it is, but the game does it so frequently that it becomes a fact of the playthrough. The player is going to get ganked by too many enemies. It's part of the game's identity, and I like it. The cast of characters are rather terse, the side characters especially. There's this lack of gentleness or courtesy throughout every dialogue that is initially quite grating, yet over time it stops being detectable. There is no time for niceties. You tell the Inquisitor what they want, and they'll leave you alone, hopefully. And so all of the Inquisitors talk to each other that way, because that must be how the world communicates now. I definitely encourage everyone to play Cult Heretic Kingdoms. You might accidentally fall under its spell. Back to bad games. 4th worst and 47th overall is PN03, Capcom's sci-fi third-person shooter that was developed as part of the Nintendo relationship remediation known as the Capcom 5. Capcom promised 5 exclusive titles for the GameCube at the start of the millennium as a return to their partnership, and of the 4 games that actually made it onto store shelves, only one of them stayed exclusive to the GameCube. PN03 stars Vanessa, a cybernetically augmented assassin who has been tasked to infiltrate a series of mysterious facilities by a faceless client. Vanessa can fire energy projectiles from her palms, as well as missiles from her back, and can use each suit's special ability to dodge enemy attacks, as well as deal some damage of her own. The game is controlled via the classic tank controls, although the player can hide behind cover and sidestep to shoot via a pirouette button. There are a few different room designs that are used to create the game's main narrative scenario, but each tile set becomes available in trial missions to broaden out the content a bit. While there may be a flashy animation every now and again, the vast majority of PN03 is excessively bland. Vanessa's design is quite boring, and the writing between missions makes her seem even less interesting than she already looks. The environments are very plain. Often the player will be running down similar looking white corridors, fighting the same handful of enemies over and over again. This feeling isn't helped by the aforementioned trial missions, which demonstrate just how uninteresting the majority of the game's room layouts are. There are boss battles, but they're either trivial or utterly broken, and are thoughtlessly reused, just like everything else in the game is. However, I think PN03 commits a terrible mistake in the lack of caps associated with the shooting. Vanessa will fire a projectile for every press of the shot button, meaning that enemies can be melted with efficient mashing, and so I actually managed to strain my hand doing so. Considering its peers in the Capcom 5 were Beautiful Joe, Killer 7, and Resident Evil 4, it's quite a surprise for PN03 to be as unlikable as it is. But it's no surprise that PN03 was the only game to remain trapped on the GameCube. Sixth best is Ace Team's debut first-person brawler, Xenoclash. Released in 2009, Xenoclash follows the fallout of Gat's decision to attack the leader of his gang, his own father-mother, which sees him exiled and chased to the end of the world. Gat is followed into the wilderness by Deidre, and the pair head out to find some means of rectifying Gat's actions, or at least finding somewhere new to call home. Assigning labels to Xenoclash does feel wrong in many respects. It certainly focuses on fist fighting, but there are ranged weapons to find and use, the art style is downright unique, and the setting is totally unmatched. The people of the world are odd. Often they have unusual features like animal body parts, or stretched out faces, and that doesn't even scratch the surface of the designs of the Corwid people. The fistfights are also brutal and frantic. Rarely are trained fighters involved in the battles. Instead, it's almost entirely wild people beating the crap out of each other in the woods. Xenoclash also doesn't rely on its strangeness to create the atmosphere. There's a dryness throughout the whole game. The air seems dusty and hot, and then that atmosphere changes to humid and sticky when Gat and Deidre make their way through a swamp later in the game. It could have just been weird the entire time and gotten away with little else, but the game's quality presentation is easily one of its best aspects. I certainly think this is a great game, but there's just something about it that doesn't make it part of the top 5 in my eyes. The fights are chaotic and nasty, and the presentation is excellent, but the game sometimes comes across as a bit shallow. Gat has a lot of different attacks, but can only damage large enemies with some kind of weapon. The blind assassin boss encounter revolves mostly around shooting, leaving the game's brilliant combat system to the side to make way for some average shooting mechanics. There's a shooting gallery section late in the game, and I think it does a much better job of being focused on shooting, and that's despite the assassin throwing animals with explosives attached to them at the player. There is a secondary mode to the game that involves the player climbing a tower, fighting swarms of enemies as they go, and while it's great for the first few floors, the excitement wears off around halfway through. These are just small issues in the face of Xenoclash's expert handling of every other aspect of the game, and I will be hungrily awaiting Ace Team's next release. Deadly Premonition lands in 5th. Access Games' 2010 survival horror game is well known for being strange, filled with awkward animation, mediocre optimization, and distinctive writing. The game had been in development limbo for a couple of years prior to its release, but did eventually end up on PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC in the years following 2010. Usually this means the game is riddled with problems, and while Deadly Premonition isn't free of issues, the good stuff here is wonderful. Francis York Morgan, known mostly as York, is a fascinating, hilarious protagonist. He's goofy and often says and does silly things, but he's also much deeper at the same time. York does his rituals to prepare for a day's work. He wants to help people, and he cares deeply about justice. Being on this ride with him is one of my favorite gaming experiences I've ever had. But then there's this whole mystery of the Raincoat Killer, this town in the middle of nowhere, and the surprisingly solid horror elements to match York's zaniness. The Raincoat Killer, once a local myth, has begun killing again, and nobody in Greenvale is safe from the killer's axe. FBI Special Agent Francis York Morgan has come to the town to investigate. I expected to like Deadly Premonition before I started playing it, but I did not expect it to be as charming as it is. There's this prevailing sense of amateurism across most of the game that reveals the passion the developers clearly had for this project. There isn't a lot of music, but what's here is excellent, and I've begun noticing it in other YouTubers' videos from time to time too. Jeff Kramer's performance is iconic, and I really don't think York would have been as memorable without Kramer's inflection. The driving mechanics are not good, but the moments with York in the car are some of my favorite things about Deadly Premonition. But as much as I love it, Deadly Premonition's flaws prevent me from letting it rise much further than 5th. There are some things that are just objectively low quality, but not enough to bring the game down too much. A game that does have a lot of low quality content is the 3rd worst game on my list, and 48th overall. Other Side is a tactics game released in 2020. and the first major release from French indie studio Lightbulb Crew. The game is set in a place between reality and nightmare, where the suffering of those within one realm is clawing its way through to the other. Players manage a team of clones called the Daughters, as they battle against the forces of suffering. The player recruits units that can be one of 4 different classes, but there's also a leveling system to try and make each daughter more unique as they gain experience. Like XCOM before it, the death of a daughter is permanent, and a run can be ended by exhausting the player's forces. The game has a striking visual style, featuring a grayscale palette that is only broken by the occasional blood red spray, UI piece, or article of clothing. The eldritch enemy designs are original in their twisted ways, and the level environments are often quite impressive when first viewed. This was one of my major issues with the game. The levels are repeated constantly. There are only a handful of enemy types, and the variety in the Daughters is extremely lacking. As the player progresses through the game, they'll wind up on the same ruined city streets, or room filled with Plague Doctor statues again and again. They'll fight the same 4 eldritch cultists over and over. They'll hire gunners and shield bearers and watch them die one after the other. It gets old quite quickly, and that's before having to restart the run because all of the Daughters have died. The game also fails at the most important part of the XCOM party design, the permanent death of valued units. No daughter is ever truly dead. You can revive them. So the player is incentivized to put all of their stock into a single team, push that team to the deepest it can go, and then restart and revive their team to go again. Otherwise, they'll have to grind through a bunch of levels they've already seen 100 times over. I experienced a lot of bugs when I played Other Side back in January of 2021, and there have been a couple of patches since, although I'm unaware if any of the technical issues I had were addressed in those patches. What I can say is that none of the content-related issues have been fixed. A true roguelike mode has been added, which doesn't appeal to me, and players now have the option to buy a cosmetic pack for a game that doesn't actually contain enough engaging content or reasons to customize the characters in the first place. There's a reason only 6.3% of players have actually finished this game. My 4th favorite game of Series 1 is Cruelty Squad, the most beautifully horrific thing I've ever experienced. From the deviant minds of consumer soft products, Cruelty Squad is a first-person shooter with an emphasis on player freedom and expression, within a world that could be best described as expressive. The player receives tasks from their employer to eliminate competitors or former colleagues by any means necessary. Each task takes place in a new environment, with a new bounty each time, and new opportunities to play in any way the player wants. Cruelty Squad's setting has reached an extremely nihilistic endpoint for society. The people have little to no regard for human life. They're dangerously obsessed with consumption. The company the player works for seems to employ everybody, and any attempt to alter the whims of the board are grounds for assassination. Killing people is so routine that a clerical error results in a massive force being sent to the player's apartment to kill them, which is then immediately followed by business as usual once the player escapes. Because who else are they going to be employed by? The player character is deeply customizable, and there are multiple methods to gaining enough credits to buy items, as well as plenty of secrets to find throughout the game's levels. I think this perception of the world is horrific and deeply upsetting, but I can also appreciate that it is played for laughs in a way that's funny because it's true. Because with every day, I feel that it may actually be becoming more and more true. Not to dwell on this point too much, but for anyone socially aware enough to notice the way our modern societies are slowly sliding into the abyss, Cruelty Squad offers no escape from that misery. The future is not looking as pleasant as we'd hoped, and I think the art style really hammers that idea home. My only gripe with Cruelty Squad, the only reason I didn't put it into my top 3, is that some of the methods of achieving the game's goals aren't great to do. The idiot party level gets tedious, and crawling around in vents isn't so fun when you can fly around instead. But that's it. If you can stomach looking at this game, I highly recommend you play it. Cruelty Squad is absolutely my favorite game that was released in 2021. Next, my third favorite game is Shadows Awakening. Games Farm's final entry in this ranking and their most recently released game is the current conclusion to the Heretic Kingdom series. Another action RPG, Shadows Awakening follows the continued adventures of the Devourer as they seek to thwart the Pentanera's schemes, keep Kretens alive, and collect the souls of powerful warriors to use going forward. Shadows Awakening is a very thoughtful game, both mechanically and narratively, which consistently impressed me the more the game continued. The player gains more and more options within the gameplay as they find new souls and earn experience and gear for the characters they were already in possession of. There are a range of characters to choose from, some focusing on casting spells, some on building defenses and fighting the enemy up close, and some that stay out of the enemy's reach and shoot them with projectiles. Sometimes a particular character type is required to progress, but for the most part, the player is able to choose who they'd like to play at what time. The Devourer is ever present, and represents the only way the player can truly be defeated. If the Devourer goes down, the player needs to load a checkpoint. The narrative of Shadows Awakening follows the theme of taking responsibility for one's path. It's easy to say that our current selves may be our best, but pretending the past never happened is to be disingenuous and present a false image of oneself. The members of the Pentanera are prodded to reflect on themselves by the player's actions, while the various souls being held within the Devourer do some similar character analysis now that their lives are over. I like this game a lot. Games Farm created a series so full of charm, depth, and recognizable components that all culminate within Shadows Awakening. If a developer with as few game development resources as Games Farm were to create a game half as good as Shadows Awakening, it would be a praiseworthy feat. The presentation is stunning. The Heretic Kingdoms are rich with history and life, and the people within it have distinct cultures to draw from when making judgments. It's rare to see a villain character grow in a video game, and yet Shadows Awakening has their villains grow in different ways. I have some issues with some of the voices, mainly that the performances weren't always great, and the dragon character should have really had some effects to make it sound less like a guy putting on a silly voice. But these are nitpicks, and the only things holding the game back from the top spot, because flawlessness was apparently necessary. Second worst, 49th overall, although potentially my least favourite if I'm feeling spiteful on a given day, is Body Harvest, DHS Design's precursor to Grand Theft Auto that was released exclusively on the Nintendo 64 in 1998. Humanity had been hunted to near extinction by an evil alien army, and as a last-ditch attempt to save his species, Adam Drake travels back in time, back to when the aliens first arrived on Earth, to try and stop the future from ever happening. This leads him to a few different places across the world, battling the insectoid aliens, and doing his best to save human lives in the process. There are rudimentary driving mechanics, and the seeds of what would eventually become GTA's shooting mechanics are here too. The levels are also open environments, segmented into chunks via the alien shield generators, that the player must destroy to access the next chunk. The game had been conceived as a launch title for the Nintendo 64, but Nintendo decided to knock it back, and Body Harvest didn't see publication until after Grand Theft Auto had exploded in popularity. I think Nintendo rejected it for a good reason. The Nintendo 64 wasn't the most powerful system, and suffered from typical cartridge-related problems like slowdown and high production costs. Body Harvest does not run well on the console. It's often excruciating how slow Drake moves, whether on foot, or aiming the reticle, or even within a vehicle. The size of the maps and the game's insistence on spawning waves of enemies continually makes things seem even slower and more dangerous for the player. If your only means of dodging enemy attacks while on foot is to run away, then Drake cannot have the abysmal running and turning speeds that he has. This feeds into Body Harvest's other major misstep, the lack of checkpoints. Gaps between checkpoints can be as long as 40 minutes, and things often get more dangerous the closer the player gets to the next. I spent hours trying to travel between 2 points, because Drake drowns after being in water for 5 seconds, and the ending of the segment required the use of a boat. There aren't even opportunities to screw around with the vehicles, because a harvest event could occur at any moment and cause the player to be sent back to the checkpoint entirely arbitrarily. I'm sure the game runs great when emulated, but on original hardware, Body Harvest is a terrible mess. My second favourite game of the year is one of the games I've played most recently, and undeniably one of the most important games of all time. Deus Ex, Ion Storm's masterpiece immersive simulation, is the story of J.C. Denton, a technologically augmented super spy who must save the world from greed, corruption, and a deadly disease that has the population on its knees. The world is run by secret cabals hiding behind secret cabals, each scheming to destroy the other, and JC is caught in the middle. His own brother defects to a terrorist organization before sending JC to Hong Kong to meet with the Chinese triad. Along the way, JC becomes more embroiled in the conflict, with different sides urging him in different directions until the game's climax, where JC must decide the fate of the world. Players must use JC's incredible skill and customizable augmentations to complete the tasks at hand, which are often open-ended and have multiple outcomes depending on the player's actions. The player can choose to enter levels all guns blazing, murdering every enemy they come across and forget all about subtlety, or they can try to enter and exit levels without anybody noticing they were there, or anything in between. This gives the gameplay a surprisingly modern feeling, as player choice has become rather prevalent within most popular video games nowadays. And while the presentation is definitely a product of the late 90s, the resurgence of low-poly models within the indie game industry keeps Deus Ex from looking as old as it is. I loved every moment of Deus Ex. I found it hilarious, intriguing, exciting, and liberating all at the same time. It doesn't take itself too seriously. Ion Storm knew that this kind of plot was inherently quite silly, and they wrote JC into a bit of a wisecracker because of it. But they also knew that things could get too real, and the humour lifts the mood when things do get dark. Deus Ex features some immense stakes, as well as some whiplash-inducing twists, with some fascinating explanations for the most shocking inclusions in the narrative. The high stakes raises the tension throughout the latter half of the game too, giving everything an urgency that kept me playing much longer than I normally would have. And the ability to overcome those hurdles in any way the player chooses is excellent. Some levels I'd spend as much time as I could sneaking around to try and avoid ever being spotted, while other times I'd get seen fairly early and have to rush to stop that guy from alarming the rest of the facility, which would result in a chain of panicked murders as each new guard would notice the last one fall over just as I'd reach them. The chaos is great. Play Deus Ex if you've never played it before, and play it again if you have. My least favourite game of Series 1, the game in 50th place overall, is Eldar Saga. Released on the Wii in 2009, Eldar Saga is an action role-playing game set in a fantasy warfront, where things have ground to a miserable halt. The humanoid races who had allied to defeat the evil monsters from the north have begun to disperse. The dwarves, the elves, and the halflings have drifted away from the humans over time, allowing the monsters time to rearm and resurge. A young mage enlists the player character from the local guild. hoping they can be the one to revive the humanoid alliance. As a guild member, as well as the one answering the mage's requests, the player is sent out to different parts of the region to battle any monsters that have appeared there in an effort to appeal to the local leadership. Sometimes this involves entering one of the game's dungeons, slashing through multiple floors before coming across a boss battle in the end. Once the alliance is reformed, time jumps forward a while, and the player switches to playing as the original character's child. The alliance is losing ground, the mage turned out to be a traitor, and things are as dire as ever. As an RPG, the game offers the player a number of jobs to play with, some stats to level, and gear to collect and upgrade. This RPG side of the game is awful. The jobs require a significant cash investment to unlock, can only be unlocked for a single character, and require vastly different stats and gear from every other job, which are things the player is not likely to possess. Body Harvest and Eldar Saga are similarly punishing, but at least reaching the end of a stage is somewhat possible within Body Harvest. Weapons have durabilities within Eldar Saga, and gear cannot be changed while out of town, so if the player's sword breaks, they'll need to return to the nearest settlement to repair it, or they can bring a consumable to fix it, provided they can afford to buy the consumables. Money is tight, and dying at any point means losing a large portion from one's wallet, as well as a random selection of items from the player's inventory. So death means fewer resources to dive back in and continue playing. Grinding enemies is possible, but experience and item drops come in such pathetically small quantities that it could easily take a couple of hours of grinding to recover after a single death. And guild quests are finite, only offering a few total quests before no longer being an option. As the end of the game approaches, the player's inventory and wallet dwindling, the game devolves into multiple dungeons in sequence with no breaks. The only way out is death. The only incentive is a crappy, boring story. Thus, the only option is to stay far away from Eldar Saga. And finally, the game I enjoyed the most out of the last 50 I've played. As much as I loved Deus Ex, Shadows Awakening, and Cruelty Squad, the one that I'd recommend above all is Disco Elysium. Estonian independent developer Zaum's 2019 release, Disco Elysium is a tremendously original, fabulously unique role-playing game about a terminally depressed alcoholic detective sent to an oft-forgotten part of town to investigate a lynching. The player meets the detective at his most vulnerable, trapped in a deep dissociative episode, hungover, and regaining consciousness unclothed in the middle of a far-off hotel room. In this state, the player has to pick up all of the pieces of Harry's life and still investigate the murder. There isn't a traditional RPG party to form within Disco Elysium. Instead, Harry has segmented the pieces of his character into personified voices within his own mind, and the player levels those segments to make their presence throughout the game more impactful. The questions the game asks, the scenarios the player can end up in, who they will work with and why, all of which makes the game highly replayable, and filled with special new interactions long after other games would be done. Disco Elysium's impressionist art style and the hand-painted textures are gorgeous, and the game's soundtrack is something I find myself listening to frequently. For a game that is very focused on its writing, I think Zaum could have easily gotten away with a less detailed, less real environment. The cracks in the roads, the war-damaged buildings, the people who live amongst it all are fantastic attention to detail that really bring Martinez to life. Harry is often presented as an irredeemable mess, and yet I desperately want him to succeed. He's malleable to the player's preference, but is still very distinctly his own person, and possesses skills that he cannot lose to a bender. In the standalone video, I explained how Disco Elysium is not the kind of detective story that allows the reader to solve the mystery before the characters do. I have seen this style of story criticised for being unsolvable, which I think is an error of judgment on the reader's end and not the author's. Harry and Kim are professional detectives. Their ability to solve crimes needs to be shown in order for their employment to make sense. I like that Disco Elysium is this kind of detective story. It lets Harry be more than a hopeless mess without the player's input. It deepens his character. And this is just one example of the many risks Disco Elysium takes that makes the game an example of unequaled genius. So that was it. That was 50 games ranked in order of my enjoyment of them. Like I said at the start, there were a lot of different platforms, a lot of different genres, and a whole lot of things to say about each game. I hope you enjoyed the video, however much of it you watched, and I thank you for hearing me out for as long as you did. If you agree with my rankings or disagree, let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear your opinions on this too. Also, I have plans for more content, although the 20-minute analysis videos are going to be on the back burner for a little while longer. If you'd like to see what's next, please subscribe. I'll see you in Series 2.